An hour after they fired her, Brooklyn Bennett was still in her scrubs. 28 years old, a registered nurse with no job, no coverage as of that afternoon, and one insulin pen left in her bag. She was type 1 herself, had been since she was 12, and that pen was the only thing standing between her and the hospital she'd just been walked out of. 3 days, if she was careful. Then, cutting through an alley off Bridgeport, she heard the breathing. Fast, deep, wrong. An old woman was slumped against a brick wall in a faded coat, skin hot and dry, eyes sunken, something sharp and chemical on her breath. Brooklyn didn't need a chart to read it. She called 911 first. 14 minutes, the dispatcher said, and 14 minutes was too long. So the nurse who'd just lost everything knelt down on wet concrete, took out the last pen she owned, and used it on a stranger whose name she never asked. She figured she'd find a way to cover herself later. She couldn't. What she didn't know was whose mother she'd just saved, because that old woman in the faded coat belonged to a man whose name people in Chicago said quietly. If they said it at all, and men like Lincoln Moretti don't forget a debt, not one this big. If this story's already pulled you in, hit that like button. Share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. And subscribe, because what happens next isn't what you're expecting. Now let's go back to the 40 minutes that cost Brooklyn Bennett everything. Sit down, Miss Bennett. The woman behind the desk in Human Resources at St. Bridget Medical Center didn't look up when she said it, and that was the first thing Brooklyn noticed. Because in her experience, people who had already decided something never looked up. She sat. She set her notebook on her knee, the small spiral one she carried in the pocket of her scrubs, the one she'd filled out every shift for 3 years, without a single supervisor ever asking to see it. Across the table sat Vivian Ashcroft, Chief Operating Officer, and a man from compliance whose name Brooklyn never learned because he didn't offer it. There's a discrepancy, Vivian said. 1 dose of long-acting insulin logged out of the automated cabinet on Tuesday night. Charted for a patient in room 414. Never administered. Your badge opened the drawer. Brooklyn opened the notebook. She turned to Tuesday. 10:41 at night, she said. Lot number ending in 472. I pulled it. I carried it to 414. And the patient had already been transferred to telemetry at 10:22. I brought it back to the return bin at 10:46. And I wrote the waste entry on the paper log because the cabinet screen was frozen. It had been freezing all week. I reported that too. She held the page out. Nobody reached for it. The paper log doesn't appear in the system, the man from compliance said. That's what I'm telling you, Brooklyn said. The system was frozen. There were 6 patients on my floor that night, and we were short 2 nurses. I documented everything by hand, because that's what you do when the machine won't take it. Vivian folded her hands. 6 patients isn't unusual. It is when the assignment sheet says 4. Brooklyn turned another page. She didn't raise her voice. She had learned young that the moment a woman raised her voice in a room like this, the room stopped listening to the words and started listening to the volume. 3 days before that, she said, I filed a variance on the open-hand refrigerator in the pharmacy annex. Inventory count didn't match the outbound sheet. I wrote it up. I signed it. I gave it to the pharmacy supervisor, and I never heard back. I'd like that variance in the record here too, because it's the same refrigerator this dose came out of. The man from compliance wrote nothing. Vivian didn't blink. Nobody in that room said the word variance again. Not then, not later. And Brooklyn would remember that silence for a long time afterward, the way a person remembers the exact second a door closes behind them, in a house they thought they lived in. Your position is contingent, Vivian said. That means the relationship can end at the discretion of either party, at any time, without cause. We're ending it today, without cause, without stated cause. Brooklyn closed the notebook. Then I'd like a copy of the incident report. Incident reports are internal work product. I'm the subject of it. You're a former employee of it. Vivian slid a single sheet across the table, a receipt for the badge and the locker key, and Brooklyn signed it because there was nothing in it that wasn't true. When she asked whether she was being flagged in the shared credentialing system, Vivian said the notation was standard for separations under review, and the man from compliance finally spoke, and what he said was, not eligible for rehire. 2 more things happened in that room, and both of them were arithmetic. The first was that her coverage ended that day, not at the end of the month, because contingent staff at St. Bridget weren't on the calendar cycle. The second was that a benefits coordinator called her cell before she'd even reached the elevator to explain that she could continue her health plan through federal continuation coverage for $640 a month, paid in advance. First payment due within 30 days. Brooklyn stood in the hallway with the phone against her ear and did the math the way she did every month. Quietly, without drama, the way you count stairs in the dark. Rent was $1,240 and it was due in 9 days. 640 was not a number that existed in her life. Would you like me to email the enrollment packet? The coordinator asked. Yes, Brooklyn said. Please. Because that was the other thing she'd learned. That you take the paperwork even when you can't use it. That you keep the record even when the record is only a record of what you couldn't afford. She rode down to the ground floor and walked out through the main corridor, past the long wall where the donor photographs hung in their identical black frames. The open hand banner running above them in gold. 140,000 doses distributed. No patient turned away. She had walked that corridor twice a day for 3 years. She had never once walked it without slowing down. And there was a reason she'd applied to St. Bridget in the first place, instead of the 3 hospitals closer to her apartment, a reason she had never told a single person on that floor. She didn't slow down today. She pushed the door open with her shoulder because her hands were full, and it was 2 minutes before 4 in the afternoon, and she was still wearing her scrubs. Next, the young man at the open-hand window said, and Elena Rizzo moved forward 1 step and slid her assistance card across the counter, and she did it the way she'd watched a dozen other people do it, in the 40 minutes she'd stood in that line, which was to say carefully, with both hands, the way you hand someone a document that decides you're weak. The scanner made a sound she hadn't expected. Not a beep, a flat little buzz, and the light on top of it turned red. This one's already been redeemed, the young man said. She waited for him to say something after that. He didn't. Redeemed where? System doesn't say where. It says redeemed. Then it says it twice, Elena said, because I've never used it. He looked at her then, and she saw him make the calculation that people make when a line is long and a person is old. Ma'am, if the card's been used, the card's been used. I'd like the date, she said. I'd like the location. I'd like whoever's name is attached to the redemption. He picked up the card, and he set it into the small black punch on the counter, and he pressed down, and the card came out with a half circle bitten out of the corner. He did it while she was still speaking. Now it can't be run again, he said. Prevents duplication. She looked at the punched corner for what felt to her like a long time, and was probably 3 seconds. She was 72 years old, and she had been carrying insulin in her purse since she was 29, and in all those years the thing that had never once happened to her was this, the small mechanical sound of a machine deciding she was a liar. She didn't tell him her name. That had been the entire point of coming down here herself instead of sending somebody. And she understood now that she'd gotten what she came for. Only the shape of it was worse than she'd imagined. She walked 2 blocks east to the pharmacy on the corner. The clerk at the counter typed her prescription in and turned the monitor slightly so she could see the cash price. And Elena read the number, and she said thank you, and she stepped back out onto the sidewalk. She didn't get any further than that. What she remembered next came in pieces and out of order. The way things do at that age. The way things do when the blood goes wrong. Wet concrete under her hand. A young woman's voice very close to her ear saying, "Stay with me, ma'am." And then the sound of a siren coming up the block. When the ambulance crew came around the corner with the gurney, the young woman was already talking, and she was talking in a way that made both medics slow down and listen. Brooklyn Bennett, registered nurse, Illinois license. I'm off duty, she said, and she held out the pen with both hands the way you'd hand over something that mattered. This is mine. It's prescribed to me. My name's on the label. Lot number ending in 398. I administered it subcutaneously to the left abdomen at 5:19. 911 was called at 5:16. Dispatch confirmed a 14-minute estimate. She's a type 1, ketoacidosis presentation. No trauma, no other medications given. I need you to know that so nobody has to guess later. The senior medic took the pen, looked at the label, and looked back at her. You wrote on her? Ballpoint. Forearm. He crouched and turned Elena's arm gently toward the light. In neat block letters, in blue pen, someone had printed the drug, the time, and beneath it, B. Bennett, RN. The medic took out his phone and photographed it before he did anything else, which Brooklyn had known he would, because that was procedure. and procedure was the only thing in the world that had ever protected her. Elena's fingers closed around the young woman's wrist as they lifted her. "What's your name?" she asked, though she'd just heard it said out loud twice. "Brooklyn. Brooklyn," Elena repeated, as if setting something down in a place she'd be able to find it again. The doors closed. Brooklyn stood in the alley with her hands empty, and it did not occur to her to ask the old woman's name, then or later. And that omission would end up mattering more than almost anything else she did that day. She got home a little after 7. She called the 24-hour pharmacy and asked the cash price for a box, and it was $312. She asked about the manufacturer's savings card, the $35 one, and the pharmacist explained, kindly, that her prescription was written for a different formulation and would need to be rewritten to qualify, and that her doctor's office was closed until Monday. She called the manufacturer's assistance line, and a recorded voice told her applications were processed in 5 to 7 business days. She thanked the recording. Then she opened the refrigerator door and stood in the cold light and reached to the back, behind the mustard, where there was a pen she'd started and set aside, and she turned it in her fingers and read the date she'd written on the cap in the same blue ballpoint. She'd opened it 41 days ago. 28 days was the outside limit, and she knew that the way she knew her own address. She stood there a while longer. Then she took out her notebook, and on a fresh line she wrote, "Split the doses. 7 days. Don't tell anyone." "I'm here for my locker," Brooklyn said at the security desk the next morning, and the officer on duty called upstairs, and she waited 11 minutes in the lobby with her visitor badge clipped crooked to her jacket, which is a particular kind of humiliation for someone who has badged through that same turnstile twice a day for 3 years. A staffing assistant walked her up. There wasn't much in the locker. A pair of clogs, a phone charger, a granola bar, a cardigan she'd left in there through 2 winters. She asked, again, for a copy of the incident report, and the assistant said she wasn't authorized to release that, and Brooklyn said she understood, and then she said it anyway, out loud, in the way you say a thing so that a person has to hear themselves refuse it. "I'd like a copy of the incident report dated Tuesday, and a copy of the variance I filed on the open-hand refrigerator." "I'll pass the request along," the assistant said, and neither of them believed her. They took the service elevator down because the assistant had another badge run to do, and it let them out by the loading dock, and that's where Brooklyn stopped walking. 2 men were moving insulated cold chain totes off a pallet. The gray ones with the open hand label printed on the lid and the temperature strip on the side, and they were loading them into the back of a plain white courier van. No hospital markings. No program markings. A parking permit sticker on the windshield with the name of a clinic on the northwest side, one of the cash pay walk-in places that advertised on bus benches. Brooklyn had spent 3 years learning exactly how many hands a cold chain tote was allowed to pass through and how many signatures it collected on the way. And she asked one question, in an ordinary voice, the voice you'd use to ask a stranger for the time. "Do program supplies go out on commercial vans now?" Neither man answered. One of them looked at the other one. The other one kept lifting. She stood there another second, and then she did what she had done every single day of her working life, which was to document. She took out her phone and photographed the 2 request slips she'd written, the one for the incident report and the one for the variance, holding them flat against the concrete wall so the writing would come out legible, and she took the photograph at 9:51 in the morning, and the white van and the open cargo door and the stack of gray totes sat in the background of that photograph, slightly out of focus, 40 feet behind her hands. She didn't notice. She put the phone in her pocket. From the warehouse doorway, 20 yards down the dock, Dale Hollis watched her do all of it. He didn't call out. He waited until she'd gone through the gate, and then he went upstairs. At 10:35, in her office on the 4th floor, Vivian Ashcroft dictated a complaint to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, and she was precise about the language, because Vivian was always precise about language. Diversion of a controlled substance. Falsification of a medication record. Subject a contingent registered nurse, separated for cause, currently under internal review. She had the assistant read it back twice. "Make it so she can't come back here with questions," she said. And then, because she had learned in 9 years at that institution that a sentence with no name in it can't be repeated against you, she said nothing else on the subject at all. At 11:40, she sent a 2-line message to a limited liability company that existed on paper in Delaware and nowhere else. "Reduce volume this week. Someone's looking." At 2:15 that afternoon, Brooklyn's phone rang, and a woman from Human Resources told her that the separation agreement was ready for signature and asked her to come in at 4 o'clock. Brooklyn said 4 was fine. She had no reason to know that the donor reception in the main lobby was called for 4:30, or that the local news crew had been confirmed at 3. She was shown into a small conference room on the ground floor and given a bottle of water and told someone would be right with her. Nobody came. At 4:18, a staff member opened the door and said they needed a photocopy of her driver's license and her nursing license, and the copier on this side of the building was down, and would she mind walking to the one at the far end of the corridor? She minded. She went. She left her canvas bag on the chair because she was walking 90 feet with a staff member beside her, and because it had never once in her life occurred to her that a bag was a thing that could be used against a person. At 4:21, Dale Hollis came through the side door off the stairwell. He unzipped the bag. He placed 3 vials of insulin and 1 vial bearing a red controlled substance label beneath her folded scarf, and he pulled one corner of the scarf back so that a half-inch of glass showed. He was out through the same door in 23 seconds. He had reset the permissions on the internal digital video recorder a month earlier, and he'd done it well. He didn't know that the open-hand endowment agreement required the hospital to retain all pharmacy corridor footage with a third-party vendor for 180 days. "Miss Bennett, would you step out here, please?" The door of the small conference room was standing open when she got back with the photocopies, and the corridor beyond it was full of noise, because the donor reception had started in the main lobby at 4:30, and there were maybe 40 people out there with drinks in their hands and a local news crew setting a light stand near the far wall. Brooklyn didn't understand yet why anyone would want her walked into the middle of that. She understood 11 seconds later, when a security officer she'd never spoken to lifted her canvas bag off the chair, carried it out to the long table where the caterers had set the glasses, and turned it over. Everything she owned in that building came out at once: the notebook, the clogs, her wallet, and rolling out from under the folded scarf, 3 vials of insulin and 1 vial with a red label on it. And that 4th vial was the one that changed the temperature in the room, because insulin is just insulin, and the red label meant something else entirely. Somebody made a sound. The cameraman moved without being told to. Vivian Ashcroft came through the crowd without hurrying, and her assistant came half a step behind her holding a document, and the assistant held it out and said, "We can resolve this quietly. If you sign the acknowledgement and release, the hospital won't refer it further." Brooklyn looked at the document. She didn't take it. She looked at it long enough to read the header and the first line of the second paragraph, and then she raised her head, and she said it loudly enough that the people near the light stand stopped talking. "That's printed." Vivian's expression didn't change. "It's a standard form. It's printed with my name on it, and today's date, and a description of what you say was in my bag. Somebody typed that and printed it and carried it down here before anyone opened my bag." She let that sit for a second, and it did sit, because 40 people had just watched the bag get opened, and the document had been in the assistant's hand when they walked in. Then Brooklyn did the only thing she knew how to do, and she did it slowly, in order, the way she'd been taught to run a code. "I'm going to ask for 5 things," she said, "and I'd like them in writing. 1. The lot numbers on all 4 vials, read out and recorded now, in front of these people. 2. The time this bag was opened, and the time it was first out of my sight. 3. The name of the person who searched it. 4. The name of the person who sealed it, because nobody has sealed it. It's sitting open on a table where the drinks are. And 5. The name of every person who entered that conference room between 4:18 and 4:25 while I was at the copier at the other end of this corridor." Nobody wrote anything down. "You'll have an opportunity to respond through the appropriate channel," Vivian said. "Then call the police," Brooklyn said. "Right now. If there's a controlled substance on that table, let the police inventory it, and let them tell me who touched it. We don't need police for a personnel matter. You need them for that red label and, you know it." From the edge of the crowd, near the corridor that ran back toward the pharmacy annex, a voice said, "She's telling the truth about yesterday." Everybody turned. An old woman sat in a wheelchair just past the rope line, an older man standing behind the handles, and she had been discharged at noon and had asked him, before they went to the car, to please wheel her past the open-hand window one more time, because there was something she wanted to look at again. She was still wearing the faded coat she'd come in with. "This young woman treated me in an alley off Bridgeport yesterday evening," she said. "She used her own medication. Her name is on it. The ambulance crew has it. Vivian looked at her for exactly as long as it takes to decide a person doesn't count. And you are? Elena Rizzo. Ma'am, this is a private donor reception. Vivian turned her head slightly, toward no one in particular, and asked the question in a voice pitched for the room. Who led a charity patient into a donor reception? Two things happened close together after that. A security officer took hold of the wheelchair handles and pulled it backward, out of the light, and the old man's hands came off the grips, and Brooklyn moved. She crossed 4 feet of polished floor and put herself between the chair and the officer, and she said, "Don't move her like that. She was in ketoacidosis 19 hours ago." Her phone was in her hand, and she'd been about to record. An arm came across hers, and the phone went down onto the granite and slid. And when she picked it up, the screen had a crack running corner to corner. That was the image the news camera got. Not the printed document. Not the unsealed table. A woman in scrubs with a cracked phone in her fist, standing over a wheelchair, and Vivian Ashcroft's voice saying calmly, "Please escort her out." They walked her through the lobby and out the revolving door. The cardboard box with the clogs and the cardigan came out 2 minutes later, and a man set it down on the sidewalk beside her, and the canvas bag did not come out at all, and nobody gave her a receipt for it. It was 6 minutes past 5 in the evening. Brooklyn sat down on the second step, took the notebook out of the box, and wrote the time. The clip went up sometime that night, and by Saturday morning it had been reposted enough times that Brooklyn stopped counting. And the thing about the clip was where it started. It started at the exact second the vials came out of the bag. It did not contain the 23 seconds in the conference room, and it did not contain the printed document in the assistant's hand, and it did not contain her 5 questions, because the camera had come up late and the edit had come down hard. And by Sunday, the version everybody was sharing ran 19 seconds and carried a caption that said, "Nurse caught with stolen charity meds at St. Bridget. Her license was not suspended." That surprised people who didn't understand how it works, and Brooklyn understood how it works. And that was precisely why she couldn't sleep. A complaint filed with the state regulator sits in a queue for months. It doesn't take your license. What it does is sit there, open, and every hospital in the country runs the same background query, and the query returns a pending complaint and a separation notation, and now a video, and no staffing office in America has to explain why they went with the other candidate. She had 3 agency shifts confirmed before any of this. All 3 came back inside 48 hours. The first agency called and used the phrase pending resolution. The second sent an email with no subject line. The third didn't call at all. And when she checked the portal, her name had been moved to a status she'd never seen before. She applied to 11 positions across 4 health systems on Saturday and Sunday. 9 of them ran through the same shared credentialing service. There was nowhere in the city to go, and no other city where the query would come back different, because the query is national, and that is the part nobody tells you when they hand you the license at 22, that the license is the whole career, and the complaint is the whole license. On Monday morning, her landlord taped a notice to her door instead of knocking, and he did it at an hour when he knew she'd be inside to hear the tape being pressed down. A nurse she'd worked nights with for 2 years sent her a message that afternoon, and Brooklyn read it 4 times, and it said, "I believe you. I can't be involved in this." Brooklyn didn't answer it, not out of anger, but because there wasn't an answer that was both honest and kind. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and did the one thing available to her. She copied every photograph off her cracked phone and out of her email onto a flash drive, and then she uploaded the same files to a cloud account and shared the folder with a second address she'd made years ago and never used. Receipts, the pharmacy printout with the lot number, the screenshot of the 911 call log, the 2 photographs of her request slips against the concrete wall. It took 40 minutes, and it accomplished nothing visible, and she did it anyway. Because a person who has been erased once learns that a copy in a second place is not paranoia, it's arithmetic. Across town on the North Shore, Elena Rizzo watched the same 19 seconds on a tablet with the sound off. She watched it 3 times. She was looking at the table, not at the girl, and what she saw was that the table was never sealed, and that a document was in the assistant's hand before the bag was open, and she had spent enough of her life around men who arranged outcomes to recognize the architecture of one. Frank Delaney came in with his notebook and read her the plate number off the white courier van, which he'd written down on Friday afternoon while he waited by the car, along with the name of the clinic on the windshield permit. She had him repeat both twice. Then she asked him for the folder from the desk, and she read the 9 letters again, the ones that had come to the parish office over 14 months and been forwarded to her because her name was on the endowment documents. Elderly man told his card had already been used. Woman asked to pay $200 to have her card reactivated. Man photographed, holding a box, before he was allowed to take it home. She had read them all before. She read them again anyway, because the letters had been abstractions until Friday, and now one of them had happened to her at a window with a red light on it, and one of them had cost a young woman her entire profession inside of 36 hours. At 4:15, she called Nathan Cole. Article 9 of the endowment agreement, she said. The inspection clause. I want every system record at St. Bridget preserved from Thursday morning forward. Badge logs, cabinet logs, pharmacy corridor video, dispatch records, the loading dock. Serve it today, in writing, to their general counsel and to the outside vendor, not to their operations office. Cole asked whether she wanted it done in the foundation's name. In the foundation's name, she said. Not mine. There was a pause on the line, the kind lawyers leave on purpose. Mrs. Moretti, your son is going to hear about this within a week. Elena looked at the tablet, where the 19 seconds had frozen on a woman in scrubs holding a cracked phone. Don't tell Lincoln, she said. Where were you Thursday afternoon? Lincoln Moretti had asked his mother on Saturday, and she'd said she'd gone downtown, and he'd asked which part of downtown, and she'd said she was 72 years old and didn't need an itinerary approved, and that was the end of it. And that was the problem, because in 37 years, his mother had lied to him exactly twice, and both times it had been to protect somebody. So he did what he did, which was find out. It took a day and a half. Frank wouldn't say a word, and Frank not saying a word told him more than a report would have. By Tuesday evening he had the ambulance run number, the intersection, and the name printed on the pen the medics had logged into evidence, and he had watched 19 seconds of video twice. He came alone, at 9:40 in the evening, and he waited in the third-floor hallway of a walk-up in Bridgeport, standing well back from her door, so that when she came up the stairs, she'd see him before he was close to her. She stopped 4 steps from the landing. You're Brooklyn Bennett, he said. Yes. My name is Lincoln Moretti. The woman in the alley Thursday was my mother. Brooklyn didn't move off the stairs. She stayed where she was with her keys in her hand and a plastic grocery bag hanging from her wrist, and she said, Is she all right? That was the first question she asked, and he registered it, and it changed nothing about what he'd come to do. She's home. She's stable. He took an envelope out of his coat and set it down on the small metal table by the radiator, the one where the mail nobody claimed piled up, and he stepped back from it. That's $250,000. Cash. There's a second envelope inside it with a name and a number in Phoenix, a lease that's already signed, and a contact who handles licensure matters in Arizona. Your complaint in Illinois stops being your problem, because you stop being in Illinois. In exchange, you don't discuss Thursday. You don't discuss my mother, and you don't discuss the hospital. Not to a reporter, not to a lawyer, not on the internet. He said all of it the way a man reads a delivery confirmation. No emphasis anywhere. Then he did something with his face that wasn't quite a change of expression, and he continued in exactly the same voice. There's another option, and I'd rather you heard it from me. Vivian Ashcroft can stop existing as a problem. Her position, her credentials, her ability to be hired anywhere in this state. That's the small version. He paused for less than a second. Or something else. You'd never hear about it, and you'd never be asked about it. The hallway light was on a timer, and it clicked, and neither of them reached over to reset it. Brooklyn set the grocery bag down on the floor because her arm was tired, and she took her time about it, and that was the moment Lincoln understood that she wasn't going to scream, and she wasn't going to cry, and this was going to be more difficult than he'd budgeted for. You've read the complaint they filed, she said. I've read it. Then you know what it says. Diversion of a controlled substance. Falsification of a medication record. That's not gossip, Mr. Moretti. That's a document sitting in a state file with my license number on it. It doesn't disappear because I moved to Phoenix. Arizona runs the same query. Every state runs the same query. That can be handled. By whom? By the same kind of arrangement that put a red label vial in my bag. He didn't answer that. And the other thing you offered. She looked at him then, straight on, and she didn't hurry. You'd be doing it for your mother. I understand that, but you're not thinking it through, and I've had 4 days to think about nothing else. The only thing that clears my name is a piece of paper from St. Bridget saying they were wrong, signed by somebody with the authority to say it. If Vivian Ashcroft loses her job, that paper never gets written, because the only person who can order a correction is a person who's still there to be embarrassed by the truth. And if she disappears, it's worse. It's not just that the paper never gets written. She picked the grocery bag back up. Dead people can't sign a retraction. You do that, and I'm a thief for the rest of my life. And everybody who watched that video gets to keep being right. Lincoln stood in that hallway and looked at her for a long time, long enough that the light clicked off and came back on when she shifted her weight. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for the envelope. He said, "Good night, Miss Bennett." And he walked down 3 flights and out onto the street. And he left the envelope where it was. And she left it there too. And it sat on the metal table by the radiator for 11 more days before a neighbor's mail slid over the top of it. In the car, he made one call. He gave the address, the floor, the fact that she walked to a bus stop on Halsted. And then he said, 2 men, rotating. She doesn't see them and she doesn't get approached. There was a question on the other end. "No," Lincoln said. "Nobody touches her. If she goes down in the street, you call 911 before you call me. Close the door, Simon." Vivian Ashcroft didn't offer him the chair, and Simon Whitaker had been at St. Bridget long enough to know that when the chair wasn't offered, the conversation wasn't a conversation. He stood. On her desk was a printout of the pharmacy variance log, and he could read enough of it upside down to know which pages she'd pulled. 3 items, she said. The Thursday incident gets reclassified. Right now it's sitting in the system as an inventory discrepancy under investigation. It goes in as theft by a separated employee. That's cleaner and it's accurate. Simon said nothing. Second, the outbound manifest for the open-hand cold chain totes, the one dated Friday, needs the ship date corrected to Tuesday. There was a data entry error. "The totes went out Friday morning," he said. "I know when they went out. I was told Friday. The manifest says Friday. The receiving partner recorded Tuesday. One of those is wrong, and it isn't going to be the partner. Then the partner's record is wrong. Correct it, Simon." He looked at her for a second longer than was comfortable for either of them. "And third, the inventory variance from last week gets closed. Resolved, reconciliation attached, no further action." Simon set his hands behind his back, which was a habit he'd picked up from his father, who'd been a machinist, and who had also learned it in rooms where he wasn't offered a chair. "I filed that variance because the count didn't match. Closing it doesn't make it match. Closing it means the matter has been reviewed." "By whom?" "By you." He didn't answer, and Vivian let the silence run. And then she did the thing she was very good at, which was to lay the invoices on the table in order, the way a doctor lays out an X-ray. "Your performance review is next month," she said. "Mine's the second signature on it." She turned a page on her desk without looking down. "Your mortgage lender has been waiting 9 days on an employment verification letter from us. It's on my desk. There's no rush on my end." Another page. "And your sister's in her final year in the nursing program at the community college. There's a tuition assistance award that comes out of this institution's education fund, and the committee that approves it reports to operations. I signed off on hers in August. Renewals come up in 6 weeks." Simon felt the heat come up the back of his neck, and he heard his own voice come out level, which surprised him. "My job is questions. Your salary is compliance," Vivian said. She pushed the folder across the desk. 9 o'clock tomorrow." He took it. He didn't know what else to do with his hands. He walked out with his back straight and his stomach burning, and he sat down at his own desk on the 2nd floor and did not open the folder for 4 hours. At 11:50 that night, the floor was empty, except for the hum from the mailroom and a printer somewhere down the hall that nobody had turned off. And Simon Whitaker did not alter a single record. What he did was worse for him and better for everyone else. He ran a query. He pulled every open-hand assistance card that had been scanned as redeemed more than once. And he set the date range wide because he had a feeling about it. And the count came back at roughly 1,900 cards. And the earliest duplicate was 6 years old. 6 years. Not 6 months. Not since the program expanded. Not since the new scanners. 6 years. 3 distribution sites. The same pattern repeating in a rhythm so regular that when he sorted it by quarter, it looked less like error and more like a payroll. Then he ran the second query, the one he'd been avoiding, because he already knew what the answer would do to him. He pulled the cabinet access log for Brooklyn Bennett's badge over the previous 4 months and set it beside the human resources time and attendance file, and he lined the timestamps up by hand, and there were 9 occasions on which her badge credential had opened a refrigerated drawer in the pharmacy annex, at hours when the turnstile record showed she had already badged out of the building. 2 of those were on days she'd been off the schedule entirely. He sat back in the chair. There was no thunderclap and no music. The printer down the hall finished a job that belonged to nobody and went quiet. Simon copied the query results into a protected folder that only he could open. And then he did the thing that mattered most, and that no one would ever thank him for at the time, which was to write himself a plain note, recording the date, the exact hour, the source system, and the search terms he had used, so that later, if anyone asked, it could be proved that he had found it rather than built it. He looked at the send field on the disclosure form for a long while. He thought about the letter on Vivian's desk, and about his sister, who was 2 semesters from a license of her own, and who called him every Sunday to complain about clinicals. He closed the form without submitting it. He shut the folder, locked the drawer, and picked up his coat, and a colleague from billing came past with a paper cup of coffee and said, "Long night?" And Simon said, "Not really," and went home. "Did you consent to the search?" Ruth Kessler asked. And she asked it before Brooklyn had finished sitting down. And she asked it the way a triage nurse asks about chest pain, with no cushion around it at all. The legal aid office was 3 rooms above a currency exchange on the near southwest side, and there were 9 people in the waiting area when Brooklyn got there at 8 in the morning, and she'd taken a number and sat with the cardboard box on her lap because she hadn't wanted to leave the notebook at home. "No," Brooklyn said. "I wasn't asked. I came back from the copier and it was already on the table." "Did anyone call police?" "I asked them to. Twice. They didn't." Ruth wrote that down and didn't comment on it. "Was there an inventory? A signed list of what came out of that bag, sealed in front of you?" "No. It sat open on a table with drinks on it." "Did the bag leave your line of sight?" 90 feet of hallway and about 7 minutes. Cameras. Brooklyn had been waiting for that one. "There's one in the pharmacy corridor outside that conference room. It covers the side door off the stairwell." Ruth stopped writing for the first time and looked at her, and then went back to writing. "All right," she said. "Now listen, because this next part is the only good news you're going to get today, and I don't want you to misunderstand what it does and doesn't do." Ruth put her pen down. "In this state, there's a statute protecting a licensed healthcare worker who provides emergency care in good faith, without compensation, outside the scope of employment. It exists precisely for what you did in that alley. It doesn't touch the vials they say were in your bag. It doesn't touch the complaint. What it does is make the alley itself unusable against you, and they were counting on the alley, because a nurse using medication on a stranger on a sidewalk sounds terrible until you look at the 4 things you happen to do correctly." She counted them on her fingers. Flat. No warmth in it. You called 911 before you touched her. That's the whole difference between emergency care and something else. You documented at the scene, on her arm, in front of witnesses, and the medic photographed it. You surrendered the pen to the ambulance crew instead of putting it back in your pocket, and the pen was yours, prescribed to you, filled at a retail pharmacy that keeps a dispensing record with a lot number on it. That last one is the one that saves your career, because it means the medication you used can be traced to a box that was legally yours, which means it did not come out of that hospital's refrigerator. Brooklyn found she had to look at the desk for a moment, not because it was comforting, because she had done all 4 of those things out of habit, at 5 in the evening, alone, with nobody watching and nothing to gain, and now a stranger was telling her that the habit was the only wall standing between her and the end of her life's work. "Now the warning," Ruth said. "You're going to be tempted, and people are going to advise you to do it. Do not post anything about that patient. Not her age, not her condition, not the block, not a photograph, not to defend yourself, not in a comment, not in a private group. You will feel that the truth is on your side. It won't matter. You disclose protected health information, and you hand them the one violation you actually committed, and that ends you, and nothing after that will save you. If anyone asks about the patient, you say you provided emergency care, and you decline to discuss the patient. Understood. Say it back. I don't discuss the patient. Good." Ruth pulled a legal pad toward her. 4 things today. First, a preservation letter to their general counsel. Not to human resources, not to operations. Counsel. It puts them on notice that video, badge logs, Cabinet logs and the manifest records are subject to a legal hold, and after today, if something is missing, the missing is the evidence. Second, a written records request for the incident report, the inventory of what they seized, and your variance filing. Third, a written response to the state regulator, which you file now, not when they get around to you. And it doesn't argue and it doesn't accuse anybody. It states facts and it lists documents. Fourth, you keep every original, paper in one place, digital in two. She looked up. You'll notice none of that clears you. I noticed. It won't for months. What it does is stop the story from being only theirs. Brooklyn signed the response at 11:40 in the morning, and the office sent the letters by email and courier before noon. She rode the bus home with the box on her knees. When she got there, she pushed the kitchen table against the wall and laid it out in rows the way she'd laid out a med pass for 6 patients. The pharmacy printout with the lot number, the 911 log, the ambulance run number, the photographs of the 2 request slips, the notice from her landlord, the 3 agency cancellations, the message from the nurse who believed her. There was one thing she couldn't lay down, and it was the smallest, and it frightened her most, which was that she was on day 4 of the pen from the back of the refrigerator. She said, out loud, to nobody, I was afraid in that room. And she remembered what Ruth had said when she'd admitted it, which was, being afraid doesn't make your refusal smaller. Then she opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote across the top, I am not going to disappear. You ever run a dish pit before? The man asked her, and Brooklyn said no, but she'd worked 12-hour shifts on her feet for 6 years, and he said that was close enough and paid cash at the end of every night. No paperwork, nothing that went into any system anywhere, which was the only kind of work available to a woman whose name came back flagged in every query in the country. It was a diner on Halsted, with a lunch rush that started at 11 and didn't let go until 2. She was on day 7 of the pen from the back of the refrigerator. She had made it last by taking less than she needed, which is a thing that sounds like discipline and is actually a slow negotiation with your own body, and she'd known from the first morning that it wasn't working the way it should, because a pen that's been open 41 days isn't the medicine anymore. It's the memory of the medicine. She had been careful. She had eaten what she could afford, which was rice and eggs, and she had drunk water until she was sick of the taste of her own tap, and she had told nobody, exactly as she'd written in the notebook. Around 1:15, the noise in the kitchen began to come to her from farther away than it was. She noticed it the way you notice weather. The dish machine's cycle sounded like it was happening in the next building. She set a stack of plates into the rack, and her hand didn't close all the way, and she looked at her own fingers and watched them not close, and she thought, in a very clear and detached way, that she would need to tell somebody in a minute. Then the floor tilted. Not fell. Tilted, the way the deck of a boat tilts, and she put her hand out for the edge of the counter, and the counter had moved. The last thing she was sure of was the smell of bleach, and someone shouting a name that wasn't hers. In the parking lot across the street, a man who had been sitting in a car for 6 days with a newspaper he never read got out, walked to the door of the diner, and called 911 at 1:19 in the afternoon. He gave the address twice. Then he called a second number and said 4 words. She woke up in a private room. That was the first thing she understood. Before the light or the tubing or the taste in her mouth, that the room had 1 bed in it, and a door that closed and a window with a view of a parking structure. And she was a nurse, and she knew what a room like that cost, and she knew she couldn't pay for a hallway gurney, let alone this. Lincoln Moretti was sitting in the chair by the window with his coat folded over the back of it. He didn't stand up when she opened her eyes. He waited until she'd been awake long enough to be embarrassed about the gown, and then he said, "They're keeping you until tomorrow at least." Brooklyn's voice came out wrong. "I can't pay for this room. It's paid. That's not the same as I can pay for it." "No," he said, "it isn't." He let a moment go by. Then he said, "I spoke to the pharmacy on Ashland. I have your dispensing record. The last box you filled was 6 weeks before Thursday. You didn't fill another one. You couldn't." He wasn't asking. "The pen you used on my mother in that alley was the only working pen you had in the world. And then you went home and opened one you'd already used up, and you split what was left of it across 7 days, so nobody would know." She looked at the ceiling for a while, because it was easier than looking at him, and because she had nothing to correct in any part of what he'd said. "Why?" Lincoln said. She turned her head. "Because she was dying and I had the exact thing that keeps her alive. Everything that happened after that belongs to the people who chose to do something wicked." He didn't say thank you. He didn't say she was brave or good or that his mother wouldn't be alive without her. And Brooklyn found, obscurely, that she was glad of it, because gratitude in that room would have made the whole thing a transaction. And she had already refused a transaction once in a hallway on the 3rd floor. He sat with it for what seemed like a long time. Then he asked, in the same voice he used for everything, "Who's the attending on your case?" "Dr. Reyes. Endocrinology consult in the morning." Lincoln wrote nothing down. He stood, took his coat off the back of the chair, and paused at the foot of the bed. "You should sleep," he said. And it wasn't kindness. It was an instruction. And then he went out into the corridor and closed the door most of the way behind him. Through the gap she could hear him. Not the words, only the shape of it. A man speaking evenly and briefly to somebody who was not permitted to argue with him, and it went on for less than 2 minutes. Then his footsteps went away down the hall. And Brooklyn lay in a room she couldn't afford, in a hospital that wasn't St. Bridget, and stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them the way she counted stairs in the dark. "There's a woman in the chapel who'd like 10 minutes with you," the nurse said the next morning. And Brooklyn said she didn't know anybody in this hospital. And the nurse said, "She's been down there since 7. And that was how Brooklyn came to be sitting in a small interfaith chapel on the ground floor at 9 in the morning, in a borrowed robe over her own clothes, across from an old woman in a wheelchair with an older man waiting out in the corridor with his hat in his hands. "My name is Elena Moretti," she said. Brooklyn didn't move. She'd had the pieces in her lap for a day and a half, and had refused to assemble them, because assembling them meant something she wasn't ready to hold. Rizzo at the rope line, Moretti in the hallway. "You gave a false name at that reception." "I gave my maiden name. I've used it at every open-hand window I've stood in front of for the last 14 months. 14 months. 9 complaints came to the parish office," Elena said. "My name is on the endowment documents, so the priest forwarded them to me. I didn't send an auditor. I went and stood in the line, because I have found in my life that you cannot learn how a door works by reading a report about the door." Brooklyn's hands were flat on her knees and she could feel them shaking, and she let them shake. "You stood 12 feet away," she said, "and you watched them do it to me. You watched a security guard turn my bag over in front of a news camera, and you said 9 words, and then you let them roll you out of the room. You could have said your own name. 1 sentence. You could have ended it in 1 sentence, and you know it." "Yes," Elena said. She didn't reach for Brooklyn's hand, and she didn't produce a single tear. And Brooklyn understood later that this was the only version of the conversation she'd have been able to sit through. "If I had said my name in that lobby," Elena went on, "Vivian Ashcroft would have been standing beside me inside of 30 seconds, apologizing. By that evening, a security officer would have been terminated for acting alone. There'd have been a press statement about an isolated failure of judgment, and everything that touches the cold chain manifests, and the assistance cards would have gone into a shredder before morning. I would have saved you. I'd have lost the other 2,000. So you chose. I chose. Rich people always have a beautiful reason why the poorer person has to suffer a little." Elena took that, without flinching, which was, Brooklyn thought, the first thing about her that was worth anything. "Your investigation has time," Brooklyn said. "My insulin has an expiration date. Do you understand the difference between those 2 sentences? While your committee was reading letters, I was on day 7 of a pen I should have thrown out. Your foundation has quarters. I have days." Elena was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" "Not later. Now." Brooklyn had thought about this for a long time in a room she couldn't pay for. 4 things. And none of them are money. First, a written retraction, published on every channel that carried that clip. Not a statement on a website nobody reads. The same partner pages, the same vendor portal, the same local station. The lie traveled on specific roads, and the correction travels on the same roads. Second, a letter on their counsel's letterhead, confirming that no criminal complaint has been filed against me, and none is pending, because that's the sentence every staffing office in the country needs to see. Third, the unedited footage. All of it, from 4 o'clock that afternoon, including the pharmacy corridor. Fourth, she stopped, and then she said it. Freeze every termination and every regulatory complaint that came out of that office for the last 24 months. Not just mine. All of them. Pull them and look at them. Elena's eyes changed. Why would you ask for that? Because if they were willing to do that to me with a camera in the room, I want to know what they've been doing to people nobody filmed. Neither of them said anything for a while. Somewhere above them, a floor buffer started up and stopped. Then Elena said, "May I ask you something?" And will you answer it honestly? Because I have never been able to get an honest answer to it in 6 years. She folded her hands. What is wrong with my program? Brooklyn looked at her, and she didn't soften it, and she didn't take a breath to make it prettier. You count boxes instead of counting patients. You let the department that gets complained about be the department that investigates the complaints. You make sick people stand in a separate line under a banner with your name on it where everyone in the building can see which line they're in. You take their photograph before you hand them the medicine, and when the card fails, the system is the thing that made the mistake, but the patient is the one who has to carry the shame out of the building. Elena Moretti sat with her hands folded and did not answer for a long time. She had built that program. She had chosen the banner and approved the photographs and signed off on the separate window because it moved the line faster. Say the last one again, she said. Brooklyn said it again. Elena nodded slowly, once, and looked at the floor of the chapel, and said, I'll have Nathan Cole call you this afternoon. The door was locked when she got home, and that was the part that told her everything, because the door being locked meant whoever came in had taken the time to lock it behind them. She stood in the entryway with the discharge paperwork still in her hand and looked at the kitchen table where she'd laid everything out in rows the way she laid out a med pass, and the rows were gone. The laptop was gone. The printed folder was gone. The pharmacy printout. The 911 log. The copies of the request slips. Nothing else in the apartment had been touched. The television was still there. Her grandmother's ring was still in the dish by the sink. In the middle of the empty table, squared up neatly to the edge, was a photograph. It was a photograph of a headstone in a cemetery on the far south side, and the name cut into the granite was Grace Bennett, and there was no note with it, and no writing on the back, and none was necessary. Brooklyn stood there for a while. Then she took out her phone and called Ruth Kessler, and Ruth said, Don't touch it. Take a picture of it in place, and file a police report tonight even though nothing will come of it, because a report has a date on it. And then Brooklyn said the thing that surprised her, which was, they didn't get anything, because the flash drive was in a coat pocket in the closet, and the cloud folder was shared with a second address, and there was a paper set in a drawer at the legal aid office 3 rooms above a currency exchange. She had done that work on the worst afternoon of her life, when it had felt pointless, and it had turned out to be the only thing standing between her and starting over from nothing. Lincoln's car came at 10:30 that night, and she got in it, and she didn't argue about it, and that fact was its own kind of information about where she was. He put her in a house on the North Shore in Lake Forest, 3 bedrooms, a driveway with a gate at the end of it, a woman who came in the mornings. She slept 11 hours the first night. On the second night, she came down to the room at the back of the house where he was working, and she stood in the doorway and asked him the question she'd been carrying for a week and a half. Who are you? Lincoln closed the folder he was reading. He didn't tell her she was safe here, and he didn't say she was better off not knowing, and Brooklyn had braced for both of those, and was disarmed to get neither. When I was 19, my father asked me to do something, he said. I did it. I've never told anybody what it was, and I'm not going to tell you. She waited. That's the whole answer, he said. Anything else I say tonight would be me arranging it into a shape you could live with. Brooklyn came in and sat down across from him. She was quiet for long enough that he went back to the folder, and then she said, My mother split her doses for 7 months. He stopped. She was a school aide. Her hours got cut to 29 so they didn't have to cover her, and she never told me it had gotten that bad, because I was 22 and just licensed, and she didn't want to be a bill. 7 months of taking less than she needed. In the 8th month, she didn't need to split them anymore. She said it flatly, the way you read a chart. She applied to a program for help before that. She was told no. I always understood it as a timing problem. She applied late. The fund was already committed for the year. Nobody's fault. That's what I decided, and that's what I've believed for 6 years. She looked up. That's why I applied to St. Bridget, instead of the 2 hospitals 9 blocks from my apartment. It was the program she asked. I wanted to be inside the building that said no to her. I've never said that out loud to a single person in 3 years. Lincoln set the folder down and didn't pick it up again. 6 years ago, he said, I took over a business my father built, and I decided to make the name legal. All of it. Every line of it. I have spent 6 years on that, and it isn't finished, and it may not finish. And half the men who work for me think it's weakness, and some of them say so in rooms where they know it gets back to me. He looked at her directly. I'm not asking you to think I'm a good man. I don't, Brooklyn said. Then be the one who takes the harder road. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out plain and unbeautiful, the way most true things do, and it landed somewhere in him, and she watched it land. Neither of them said anything after that. The room was very quiet. Lincoln looked at her the way a man looks at a door he's decided not to open, and Brooklyn found that she had not moved her chair back, and the distance between them had become a thing that was being measured rather than ignored. Then his phone rang on the table between them, face up, and the name on the screen was Nathan Cole, and it was 11:50 at night, and Nathan Cole did not call at 11:50 at night. Lincoln looked at it for 1 second before he answered. He said, "Say it slowly," and then he stood up and walked out of the room. "Say it slowly," Lincoln said, and Nathan Cole said it slowly, and it took him 4 minutes. Vivian Ashcroft had been receiving $40,000 a quarter for the last 5 years from a limited liability company registered in Delaware that described itself as a healthcare logistics consultancy and had no employees, no office, and 1 bank account. That entity's membership interests were held 60% by a second entity, and the manager of record on the second entity was Rocco Bianchi. Nathan didn't editorialize. He read the filing dates and the name, and then he stopped talking and waited. Lincoln stood in the hallway of a house in Lake Forest at midnight and understood 3 things in the order they arrived. The first was why Vivian mattered to anyone. The open-hand cold chain refrigerators sat inside the hospital's own pharmacy annex, which meant the inventory reconciliation and the loading dock and the manifest sign-off all ran through one office on the 4th floor, and one signature at that desk could make a shipment that went out on a Friday exist on paper as a Tuesday, and could close a variance that a compliance officer had filed in good faith. Everything the pipeline needed was in that office. The second thing was the shape of it. Charitable medication is the cleanest cargo in America. Nobody counts what's given away for free. The third thing was worse than the first 2 together, and Nathan Cole delivered it last because he'd been a lawyer for 30 years and knew how to sequence bad news. "The authorization that opened the distribution channel is in the Foundation's file," he said. "The delegation instrument, the one that put procurement and distribution discretion under an operating manager rather than the board. It's countersigned. It's your signature, Lincoln. Page 31 of a 40-page execution set, dated the week you took over." Lincoln didn't say anything for long enough that Nathan asked if he was still there. "I signed it," Lincoln said. "I don't remember it, and that isn't a defense. I signed it." He met Rocco at 8 the next morning, in the back office of a body shop on Cicero Avenue that had been in the family longer than either of them, because Lincoln had decided on the drive over that he wasn't going to have this conversation anywhere that felt like a courtroom. He put the filings on the desk. Rocco looked at them for maybe 5 seconds, and then he pushed them a few inches away with 2 fingers, the way a man moves a plate he's finished with. "You want me to lie to you?" he said. "No. Good, because I've got no interest in it." Rocco sat back. He was 41, and he'd been in that back office since he was 20, and he'd been the one who knew every supplier's brother-in-law and every alderman's nephew, and 6 years ago when the old man went into the ground the button had gone to the son, who was 4 years younger and had a business degree, and nobody had asked Rocco anything about it, and he had never once said a word out loud on the subject until right now. "You wanted legal?" Rocco said. "That's a beautiful thing to want." I understood it. I said, "All right, the kid wants clean. We'll do clean." Then I sat down and I looked at what clean costs. He counted it off without raising his voice, and there was no bitterness in it, which was the frightening part. "You shut the sportsbook. You sold out of the 2 locals on Archer. You put the crews on payroll with withholding and workers' comp because you didn't want anybody's name on a subpoena. That's 300 families, Lincoln. 300. Guys who've been with your father since before you could drive, and their kids, and their mothers. Legal doesn't pay 300 families. Not in 6 years. Not in 12. He tapped the desk once. "So I kept this house alive while you gave speeches about the name. And in 6 years you never asked me how. Not once. You asked me if the numbers were good. I told you the numbers were good. You said thank you." Lincoln stood very still. "They put a red label vial in a nurse's bag," he said. "That wasn't me. It was your money that made Vivian Ashcroft worth buying." "That's true," Rocco said, and he didn't flinch from it, and that was somehow the worst answer available. "It's also true that she panicked. I don't do panic. Panic is what gets people indicted." He was quiet a moment. "Your mother stood in that line, Lincoln. 14 months. She's been walking into those windows. Nobody told me. Nobody knew. Would it have changed anything? It would have changed where the trucks went. He said it flatly, and it was, Lincoln realized, the closest thing to an apology Rocco Bianchi possessed. Then Rocco stood up and buttoned his coat and paused on the way to the door, and he said it in exactly the same tone he'd used for everything else. Conversational, almost warm. The nurse, Bennett. He didn't say a threat. He didn't say a name of a place, or a day, or a condition. He said, "She's a serious young woman. My wife's cousin had a boy with the same thing she's got, so I know what those pens cost. Terrible, what she's been through." And then, "Good to see you, Lincoln." And he went out through the shop, and the bell on the door rang, and Lincoln stood in the back office and understood that he had just been told, very politely, that Brooklyn Bennett was now a number in somebody's column. "It came by courier," Brooklyn said on the phone. "And there's a second envelope inside it with the statement they want me to read." The invitation was on heavy cream stock, and it came from the office of the Chief Operating Officer, and it invited Miss Brooklyn Bennett, registered nurse, to be honored at the annual Open Hand Benefit as the inaugural recipient of the Community Resilience Award, $100,000, presented in recognition of her dedication to patients in the community. The prepared remarks ran 2 paragraphs. She read them 4 times, standing at a window in Lake Forest, and they were very well written. And that was what frightened her about them. They didn't say she was innocent. They didn't say the word vials. They described an unfortunate communications incident. They thanked the institution for its compassion during a difficult period, and they used the phrase, "moving forward together," twice. If she stood on that stage and read those 2 paragraphs, every reporter in the room would have their headline. And it would be a good headline. Hospital and nurse reconcile, and the story would die that night, with everyone feeling warm about it. There would be no correction. There would be no letter from counsel. The complaint would sit in the state file for 11 more months and quietly resolve itself into nothing. And she would be, for the rest of her working life, the nurse who took the money. She also knew, standing at that window, exactly what $100,000 was. It was rent arrears of $1,240 plus late fees, and a year of her prescription without arithmetic, and a car, and the ability to look at a pharmacy monitor without her stomach dropping. It was her mother's entire problem solved 8 years too late. Anybody who says that's an easy thing to turn down has never been 9 days past due on anything. She called Elena. "Should I go?" There was a pause on the line, and Brooklyn had come to recognize what those pauses were for. "The audit committee chair will be there," Elena said. "So will 2 board members who've never once been in the same room as a complaint letter. The station that ran the clip has confirmed a crew. Nathan Cole has an invitation, and so does the state's outside counsel for the endowment." Another pause. "That is what I know. It isn't an answer. I wasn't asking you to give me one." "No," Elena said. "You weren't." Brooklyn accepted the invitation on Thursday morning by email, in one line, thanking the office for the honor. Then she made 2 calls. The first was to Ruth Kessler, who listened for 6 minutes and said only, "Bring the originals in a folder you keep on your person, and do not hand that folder to anybody who works for that hospital." The second call she didn't make. Simon Whitaker made it, to Nathan Cole's office, on a Wednesday afternoon from a parking garage, and what he said was, "I have a protected folder with about 1,900 duplicate assistance card redemptions in it going back 6 years, and a badge log that puts her credential in a drawer on nights she was already out of the building. I haven't submitted the disclosure yet. If the committee's going to be in one room, I'd rather submit it there than into a queue." Cole asked him one question, which was whether he'd altered anything. And Simon said no, not a keystroke, and Cole said, "Then bring a sealed set and a device that isn't hospital property." Lincoln said very little about any of it. He read the invitation, and he read the prepared statement, and he set both down on the table. Brooklyn asked whether he'd be there, and he said yes. She asked in what capacity, because she had learned in 10 days that with him the capacity was always the whole answer. "I'll come as the son of the woman she called a charity patient," Lincoln said, and he didn't say anything else. On the morning of the benefit, at 8:40, Vivian Ashcroft's assistant brought her a printed notice that had arrived overnight from the hospital's general counsel. All system records relating to the open hand program for the preceding period had been placed under a formal legal hold at the direction of the endowment's outside counsel, effective, and this was the sentence Vivian read twice, effective from 11:55 on the morning of the incident, not from the date of the letter. From that morning, which meant that anything altered after 11:55 would show up not as a correction, but as a separate, time-stamped act. She sat with the notice in front of her for a while. Then she asked her assistant to send in Simon Whitaker. He came in and stood, because she still didn't offer him the chair. "You made a protected disclosure," she said. "I'm not able to discuss that. You know what I like about you, Simon? You've read the policy." She turned the notice around on the desk so he could see the date on it. "You understand what this is. When the state's attorneys start asking why a compliance officer sat on a discrepancy for 2 months and then found his conscience the same week his name went into a filing, they're not going to be gentle with you. Whatever you think you're building, you're in it. You'll go down with me." Simon looked at the notice, and then he looked at her, and his voice came out steadier than it had any right to be. "Then I'll go down facing the truth. Miss Bennett, you're at table 2, right down front," the young woman with the seating chart said, and she said it warmly, and Brooklyn thanked her and walked into the main lobby of St. Bridget Medical Center at 6:47 in the evening, and it was the same room, the same granite, the same long wall where the caterers had set the glasses 11 days earlier, and where a security officer had turned her bag over in front of 40 people. They had put the stage at the other end this time, but it was the same floor, and she had picked her cracked phone up off it. There was a place card at table 2 with her name on it, and beneath her name, in the same typeface, it said Community Health Advocate. She stood looking at it for a moment. Nobody had asked her whether she wanted that title. Somebody had ordered it printed, days ago, before she'd answered the invitation, before she'd read a single line of the statement they wanted from her. And that was the whole thing in 4 words, that they had decided what she was going to agree to be, and then had it lettered on cardstock. She sat down. She put the folder Ruth had given her on the chair beneath her, and she did not put her phone on the table. At 3 tables back, Simon Whitaker sat with a sealed envelope on his knees and a small black device in his jacket pocket. And next to him were 2 members of the audit committee and Nathan Cole, and none of the 4 of them touched the wine. Lincoln Moretti stood near the bar at the back with his coat still on. Vivian Ashcroft took the stage at 7:10. She spoke for 9 minutes, and she was very good. She talked about dignity. She said the word twice, and both times she let a small pause come after it. She thanked the donors, and she thanked the volunteers, and she said that this program had never once turned a patient away. And then she said, "Tonight we want to show you that Open Hand is not only about medicine, it's about second chances." The 2 screens flanking the stage changed. The 19 seconds began to play. Vials rolling on a table. A woman in scrubs with her hand out. It ran twice on a loop with no sound, and Brooklyn sat in her chair at table 2 and watched 300 people watch it. Some weeks ago, Vivian said, "An incident occurred in this building. Emotions were high. Words were said that shouldn't have been. But we don't believe a person should be defined by the worst 9 seconds of their life." She turned. "Please join me in welcoming Brooklyn Bennett." Applause began, uncertain at first, then filling in. Brooklyn stood and walked to the stage and climbed the 4 steps, and a staff member came forward carrying an oversized check with the amount printed on it in gold. $100,000, and Vivian took one side of it and held the other side out toward her. Brooklyn didn't take it. The applause went on for 4 or 5 seconds without her hand on the check, and then it started to thin, the way applause does when the room senses something has gone off script. Vivian smiled and said, through the smile, not into the microphone, "Don't embarrass yourself twice in the same room." Brooklyn stepped past the check to the microphone stand. "I didn't come here to thank you for your money," she said. It carried. The room went quiet enough that she heard a fork touch a plate somewhere behind her. "Play the whole thing," she said. "Not 19 seconds. Start it at 4 o'clock that afternoon and include the pharmacy corridor." Vivian's hand came over the top of the microphone. Brooklyn is understandably emotional. It's been a very hard month for her. "Play the corridor footage." Vivian turned her head slightly toward the sound booth at the side of the stage and made a small motion with 2 fingers, and the microphone went dead in the middle of Brooklyn's sentence. 300 people watched a woman's mouth keep moving with no sound coming out of it. And then, from the far end of the lobby, from the main entrance where the donors had come in past the coat check, there was a raised voice that wasn't amplified at all. "Ma'am, your name isn't on the list." An old woman was sitting in a wheelchair in the doorway with an older man behind the handles. She was wearing the same coat. Not a version of it. Not a nicer one. The same faded wool coat she'd had on in the alley off Bridgeport and at the rope line 11 days ago, and she had chosen it that morning the way a person chooses a piece of evidence. "I was invited by the truth," Elena said. The security officer at the door looked back toward the stage for instruction. Vivian found her. She raised one arm and pointed from the stage across the whole length of the room and said, and the microphone at the podium was still off, but hers was the only voice in it, "Take her out of here." Frank Delaney's hands came off the grips, and a man at the back of the room, who had not spoken to anyone all evening, set down the glass he wasn't drinking from and stepped out of the crowd, and he crossed the granite floor without hurrying, and every head in that lobby turned to follow him, because there is a particular way a room turns when it doesn't yet know why. He stopped 10 feet from the wheelchair. One word. "Mama." Somewhere near table 9, a wine glass slipped out of a board member's hand and broke on the granite. The silence that came after it was heavier than the sound had been. "Bring me forward, Frank," Elena said, and Frank Delaney put his hands back on the grips and rolled her the length of that lobby, past table 9 and the broken glass, and nobody stopped them. And when she reached the front, she didn't go up onto the stage. She stayed on the floor, at the level of the room, and she spoke to the people at the tables rather than to the microphone. "On the afternoon of the 15th, I stood at the open-hand window in this building with my own assistance card, and I was told it had already been redeemed. And when I asked where, a young man punched a hole in my card while I was still speaking and told me to move along." She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. 40 minutes later, I went down in an alley off Bridgeport, and a nurse who had been fired by this hospital 1 hour earlier used the last dose of medication she owned in the world on a stranger, and then wrote what she'd given me on my arm in ballpoint pen so that nobody would have to guess. She did not describe any part of it further. 3 tables back, Simon Whitaker stood up with the sealed envelope in one hand and walked to the side of the stage where the presentation laptop sat, and Nathan Cole walked with him. And one of the audit committee members came too, and the sound technician looked at Vivian and then looked at the 3 men and did not touch anything. Simon connected the device from his jacket to the input. The 2 screens came back on. The image was gray and slightly wide angle, and time stamped along the bottom edge, and the label in the corner read the name of a third-party retention vendor, not the hospital. It was the pharmacy corridor. At 16:18, a woman in scrubs walked out of frame to the left, with a staff member beside her, carrying nothing. At 16:21, the side door off the stairwell opened, and a man came through it. And he crossed to the chair, and he unzipped a canvas bag, and he took 4 vials out of his inside pocket and put them under a folded scarf, and then he pulled one corner of the scarf back with 2 fingers and looked at it, and adjusted it, and left through the same door. The clock at the bottom of the screen went from 16:21 to 16:22. Nobody in that room said anything. The screen held on the empty chair, and Vivian Ashcroft, standing on the stage with the lapel microphone still live on her jacket, said, out loud, in a voice that was not intended to carry, and carried into every corner of 300 people, "That footage was deleted." Brooklyn heard it from 4 feet away. So did the news crew. So did the audit committee chair. Simon said, without turning around. "The local recorder was cleared. This is the off-site retention copy. It's required under the endowment agreement." Near the rear wall, Dale Hollis had been standing beside the coat check for the last 20 minutes. Every face in the 2 nearest tables turned toward him at once, and he took 1 step backward and found a hotel security officer standing where he'd been intending to walk, not touching him, simply occupying the space. Dale looked at the screen. He looked at Vivian on the stage. Then he said, in a voice that came out too loud because he hadn't meant to speak at all, "You told me to do it," Vivian said. He acted alone. "You told me to do it in your office at 10:20 in the morning, and you told me to make sure she couldn't come back here with questions." He took out his phone. His hand wasn't steady. "It's all in here. Every message." He held it out, and Nathan Cole came and took it from him and put it into an envelope and wrote the time on the front of the envelope in front of everybody. And that was all that happened to Dale Hollis in that room. Nobody put a hand on him. He sat down on a chair by the coat check and put his face in his hands. Then the screens changed again, and the audit committee chair took the podium microphone. And what came next was not dramatic, and that was precisely why it was unanswerable. 4 lines. Approximately 1,900 open-hand assistance cards, scanned as redeemed more than once. in a repeating pattern across 3 distribution sites, going back 6 years. Cold chain manifests, showing outbound shipments logged to community partners on dates. The gate records showed the vehicles leaving on different days entirely. Invoices from 2 cash pay walk-in clinics matching those quantities and those dates. Total confirmed irregular value: $6,400,000 in diverted product and false reimbursement claims. He read it in a flat voice, and he stopped when he was finished. There was no applause. 300 people sat in a hospital lobby with their food in front of them and did not know where to put their hands. Then he said one more thing, and it was the thing Brooklyn had asked Elena for in a chapel 11 days earlier, and hearing it said out loud in that room did something to her that the retraction never would have. "Effective tonight," he said. "This committee is opening a review of 47 nurse terminations issued out of that office over the past 24 months. Every one of them. I want to be very clear about what that means, because it would be easy to misunderstand it. We are not standing here announcing that everyone this institution has ever dismissed was innocent. Some of them weren't. What we're doing is separating genuine failures from retaliation, and we intend to publish both. Before you all decide what I am," Vivian Ashcroft said, and her voice was perfectly level, which was somehow worse than if it had broken, "I'd like to say one thing to the people at these tables, because half of you are on this board, and the other half have been eating dinner off my numbers for 9 years. Nobody stopped her. The audit chair could have taken the microphone and didn't, and later some people said that was a mistake, and Brooklyn never thought so. When I came here, this program was distributing about 9,000 doses a year, and running at a loss the finance committee described as unsustainable. I was told to fix it. Every quarter for 9 years I brought you growth, and every quarter you applauded, and you put the number on the wall by the elevators, and you had it printed in gold. Not one of you ever asked me how." She looked out at the room. "You wanted the number. I got you the number. And when the cost of the number showed up in the hallway with a badge and a notebook, you were all as surprised as children." She paused. "And if you want the name of the man whose company has been wiring me $40,000 a quarter for 5 years, it's Rocco Bianchi." That landed. There was movement at the back of the lobby, near the coat check, 3 or 4 people turning their heads at once toward a table on the far right, where a man in his 40s had been sitting all evening with his wife's chair pulled out beside him. Lincoln Moretti walked to the stage. He climbed the 4 steps and took the microphone from its stand, and he didn't look at Vivian, and he didn't look at Rocco. "My name is Lincoln Moretti," he said. "My mother founded the endowment that funds this program. That's her in the wheelchair in the coat." He let a second go by. "I did not order anyone to steal medication. I didn't know about the duplicate cards, and I didn't know about the vans. And I want to say plainly that none of that helps me." He shifted his hand on the microphone. 6 years ago, I signed a document that moved procurement and distribution out from under the board and put it under one operating manager. It was page 31 of a 40-page set, and I signed it without reading it. In a week when I had a great deal on my mind, and every dollar that walked out of this building walked out through a door I opened with my own signature. I built a foundation where a complaint about an operation went to the operation to be investigated. I read a dashboard every quarter, and I counted cartons leaving warehouses instead of counting people who stayed alive. And when the numbers were good, I said thank you and asked nothing else. He looked at the tables. Not knowing doesn't erase responsibility when you're the one who designed the room. Nobody applauded. 300 people sat with that, and it was the silence, more than anything said in that lobby all night, that Brooklyn would remember. Rocco Bianchi stood up at his table, put on his coat, took his wife's arm, and walked out through the service corridor by the kitchen because it was closer than the main doors. No one arrested him. No one blocked his path. 2 men who had come in with him went out ahead of him, and one of them held the door. And on his way past the coat check, he nodded once at a hotel security officer he'd known for 11 years. And then he was on the street and gone. And the threat he had made on a body shop on Cicero Avenue did not leave with him. It stayed in the building. It stayed in the car afterward. At 1:20 that morning, Lincoln sat at the table in the back room of the house in Lake Forest, with Nathan Cole across from him, and a bound set of documents between them. The filings, the wire records, the delegation instrument, with the signature on page 31. Nathan said, "If this goes to the Northern District, it doesn't stop at Bianchi. They'll take the whole structure apart, and some of what they find is going to be yours, from before, and some of it is going to be your father's. I can slow it down for 18 months. I can also lose 2 of these pages, and no one on this earth would ever know. Lincoln put his hand flat on the top of the stack and pushed it across the table. That was all. He didn't say anything, and Nathan Cole looked at the stack for a moment and then picked it up. The referral went to the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois on a Tuesday. Rocco Bianchi was indicted 11 weeks later on charges involving mail fraud, wire fraud, and the interstate distribution of misbranded prescription drugs, along with 4 other men, 2 of whom Lincoln had known since he was a boy. One of them had taught him to drive. The cost came due immediately, and it kept coming due. Of the men who had worked for his father, something close to half of them stopped answering. 2 of the businesses he'd spent 6 years making legitimate lost their financing inside a month. A man he'd trusted with his mother's schedule for a decade sent word through a third party that he wouldn't be back. In a restaurant on Taylor Street, somebody said the word rat loud enough for the next table to hear, and it got back to him, as it was meant to. He did not win that night. He chose, and then he paid for it. And those are not the same thing. And any story that tells you otherwise is selling you something. 6 weeks after that night in the lobby, the outcomes arrived the way real outcomes do, on letterhead, slowly, with none of the music. Vivian Ashcroft was terminated for cause, and her file went to the federal prosecutors along with everything else. Dale Hollis lost his job as well, and he cooperated fully, and his cooperation was noted and did not excuse him, because whatever a person's fear does to them, it was still his own 2 hands that unzipped that bag. The complaint against Brooklyn's license was closed, with a written finding, and the finding said the allegation was not substantiated, and that the evidence indicated the items had been placed in her belongings by another employee, and Brooklyn read that sentence 11 times before she put the letter in the folder. The retraction went out on every channel the clip had traveled on, the same partner pages, the same vendor portal, the same local station, and each posting carried the words falsely accused because Ruth Kessler had gone through 3 drafts, refusing every softer phrase they proposed. The money came as an itemized schedule, 3 canceled agency shifts at the contracted rate, the pharmacy price of medication she'd gone without, rent arrears and late fees, legal costs, a replacement phone. It was not called a gift, and it was not called a gesture. And when a board member's first draft used the word generosity, Brooklyn sent it back with 1 word written across the top, which was compensation. Of the 47 terminations reviewed, 31 were reinstated with back pay, and 16 were upheld with documented cause and a required remediation plan, and the committee published both lists. Simon Whitaker kept his position under whistleblower protection, and his employment verification letter went out through an independent human resources review, and his sister's tuition award moved to a separate panel so that no hand on either side could touch it. Then came the boxes. As part of the review, the Foundation ordered the archived denial files pulled from storage, 7 years of them, because the assistance card pattern went back 6, and nobody trusted the boundary. Brooklyn was in the room helping index them, and on a Thursday afternoon she opened a folder from the 2nd year and found a name she knew. Grace Bennett. Application approved. 2 boxes released. Signature illegible. Status: assistance received. Her mother had not applied late. Her mother had not missed the deadline, and the fund had not been committed for the year, and there had been no timing problem and nobody's fault. Her mother had been approved, and somebody else had walked out of the building with it. Brooklyn sat down in the chair by the window with the folder open on her knees. She didn't shout. She didn't put her hand over her mouth. She took out the notebook, and she wrote the date, and the file number, and the line as it appeared, in the same small, careful hand she'd used for 6 patients on a floor short 2 nurses, because that was the only thing she had ever known how to do with grief. 2 weeks later, the board offered her a directorship of the program. She turned it down in a sentence she'd had ready for a while. I want an opportunity, not an ornament. Dignity isn't a thing you hand down to somebody from a stage. She applied through the public posting instead, with the other 19 applicants, and the panel scored the candidates without names attached, and she was appointed clinical lead of the rebuilt program in the ordinary way, on paper, on merit, which mattered to her more than any award ever could have. 4 things changed at St. Bridget, and none of them were announced with gold lettering. Complaints stopped going to the department they were about. A card that failed at the window no longer failed in front of a line, because the resolution moved to a private room with a door and a chair. The separate queue was closed, and the branded photograph stopped, and no one's face went into a report without a signed consent in the file. And every nurse in that building was entitled to a copy of any incident report bearing her own name, which sounds small, and would have changed everything. 7 months later, there was a small community clinic on a corner in Bridgeport with a sign that read, "The Last Pen," and what it mostly did was paperwork, manufacturer applications, formulary switches, the $35 cards, the 3 phone calls a frightened person can't make at 8 in the evening because the office is closed until Monday. It existed to finish. For other people, the exact paperwork Brooklyn hadn't been able to finish for herself in one night. Lincoln came on a Friday in a suit, straight from a deposition, and Brooklyn handed him the clipboard with the refrigerator temperature log on it and told him the morning check hadn't been initialed. He initialed it. Elena came in the same faded coat and took a number from the dispenser like everybody else and sat in the 3rd chair and waited 25 minutes. And when Brooklyn finally sat down across from her, the old woman looked at her for a moment and asked, "Have you taken yours today?" "Yes," Brooklyn said. "This time I kept a dose for myself." Here is what this story is really about. Kindness is not a vending machine. You don't put in one good act and get a powerful man out the other side. And most of the decent things people do in this world are never seen by anybody who could repay them. What is true is smaller and harder and better. Illness does not remove a person's dignity. Poverty does not cancel a person's intelligence. A badge, a title, a balance in an account, none of it is permission to humiliate another human being. And the real measure of any institution is never the number on the wall by the elevators. It's what happens when a sick person's card fails, when a quiet employee asks an inconvenient question, and when telling the truth costs something. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We'd truly love to know how it landed with you. So tell us in the comments what it made you think of in your own life, and whether you've ever been the one who helped a stranger with the last thing you had. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish you good health, peaceful days, and quiet joy. And we'll see you in the next video.